How the heck do you figure out what laptop you should buy? Whether you're spending a couple of hundred, a couple of thousand? Well, hopefully by the end of this video, where I share with you my top 12 tech chat tips for buying a new laptop, you'll have a better idea. And if you do enjoy the video, a cheeky like and subscribe will be fantastic. And also I'll leave a link to some of my favorite recommended laptops right now in the description below. And with that out of the way, let's move on to tip number 1. And it's pretty straightforward, really. Figure out what you're going to be using it for. Is it just basic home office stuff, browsing, studying, shopping, watching TV and movies? Because honestly then, you don't need to spend more than maybe £350, $400. That's a good starting point for a basic Windows 11 laptop. Of course, spending more will get you better performance, nicer screens, and smarter designs, but even cheap and cheerful laptops like this will do the basics. Although I would say, if your budget is under £250, I would definitely look at a Chromebook, although I'll talk more about these in a second. In either case though, even basic machines can play demanding games, although only via cloud gaming services like GeForce Now or Xbox Cloud Gaming. And of course, these are subscription services, so you have to pay for them, and you will need pretty fast and reliable internet. But it does allow you to play games on pretty rubbish laptops. However, if you've got a bit more money to spend, I still maintain the best all-round laptop right now is the MacBook Air. Not because I'm a Tim Cook fanboy, but simply because there's no better combination of performance, battery life, screen quality, and arguably price. So I like a Mac, but it's not for everyone, and you have tons of Windows alternatives. And in that sort of premium thin and light space, you've got your Dell XPSs. This is the XPS 13 Plus, which still looks incredibly space age, and I really like this guy. You've got Asus ZenBooks, you've got the Microsoft Surface laptop, you've got Samsung Galaxy Books, and even the LG Gram range. This is the LG Gram Style. I've got the 16-inch model here, which is a beautiful laptop, but also pretty expensive. Really, you are paying a premium here for that sort of thin and light form factor. And so one thing I really do love about Windows laptops is the sheer variety. You can pick and choose whatever you want. It can be a bit overwhelming to start with, but once you sort of narrow down what you want, there's lots of options at lots of different price points, which is great. You don't really have as many options on the Mac side. And obviously, if you're a big gamer, yes, you have the Apple Arcade, and you can also do cloud game streaming with the Mac. But really, for proper gaming, you're going to want a Windows laptop because it gives you access to all the game stores, and the performance in these guys, particularly if you have a dedicated graphics card, and we'll come on to this in a second, that and also the screen quality, like the refresh rate, is also very important for gamers. A lot of gaming laptops can also double as workstations. If you are doing fancy rendering or editing or designing, then definitely look into a high-end either gaming laptop or workstation style laptop. So to sum up tip number 1, if you're on a super tight budget, as I say, you can get away with spending like £350, $400 on a basic Windows laptop, which is fine, or a Chromebook, definitely recommend a Chromebook. If you can spend a little bit more, around the sort of £1,000 mark or so, then a MacBook Air, even the basic M1 from a few years ago is still a fantastic laptop, or a sort of Windows alternative to that. Gaming laptops, genuinely, you can get decent ones that start at around £1,000 as well. With something like a RTX 3060 or an RTX 4050, that's pretty good for a basic gaming laptop, but really for top-end gaming laptops with the best screens, best performance and all that stuff, you can be looking at over $3,000. It can be a lot of money. So the first thing is to figure out what you're going to be using it for before you end up spending more money than you need. The second thing to consider is the different form factors, the different designs of laptops. If you need a little bit more flexibility, literally in this case, then how about a 2-in-1 flip, where you can literally flip the screen and transform it into a touchscreen tablet, which is great for doodling and drawing or making notes with a stylus or just your finger, or even just propping it open to watch a movie or reviewing some documents. Or even how about a tablet with a detachable keyboard? Gives you the option of having a lightweight dedicated tablet with the option of becoming a laptop when you need it. A couple of my favorite are the Microsoft Surface Pro series, and of course the iPad, which you can pair with a keyboard. Not for everyone, I wouldn't say it's a proper laptop replacement, but it's worth considering. Tip number 3, pick your OS, your operating system. Do you want to use Windows, Mac, or Chrome OS? Chances are you already know which one you like. It's the one you've been using forever. But it's worth considering if one of the others might be a better fit. Windows 11 laptops have by far the most options, so you have a lot of choice, plus it's Windows, so chances are you've used it, your parents have used it, your kids are using it, and it's compatible with literally millions of apps and programs. Mac OS on MacBooks does a similar job, but goes about it in a slightly different way, and it can feel a little bit jarring if you're coming from Windows, but I would argue it's a simpler but smoother and more premium experience, and still with great app compatibility, except for, well, games. Plus, if you have an iPhone, you can take advantage of iMessage and AirDrop, although considering the cheapest MacBook Air starts at just under $1,000, that might make your decision for you. Then there's Chrome OS, which is Google's operating system for Chromebooks, which are some of the best value laptops around. This one cost me just £200, and it gets a full 360 hinge with a touchscreen, and in my opinion, it is far better than a similarly priced Windows machine. So Chromebooks are designed for students and everyday work tasks, and battery life is usually enough to get you through a full day. The downside is Chromebooks are generally meant to be used with the internet. They're sort of cloud books, if you will, terminals to use the internet. But it's not going to be for everyone, and if you don't work out of the browser most of the time, then you may want to stick with a Mac or a Windows machine. Tip number 4, let's talk about the hardware, the specs. And while this can be a bit overwhelming, bear with me. So there's basically 5 key things you need to keep in mind. The processor, the graphics, the RAM, the storage, and then other stuff like the screen and the ports and things like that. But high level, a good all-round spec, you'd be looking at an Intel Core i3 or an AMD Ryzen 3 processor, 8GB of RAM is still the sweet spot, and then probably 256 gigs of storage. That'll do. Beyond that, you can look at the graphics card and the screen quality and the ports and everything else, but that's like a good starting point. Now for the processor, in Intel's case, we've got U-series chips, which are the lowest wattage and meant for entry-level or ultra-thin and light machines. Then above that we have the P-series, which are a little bit higher wattage and more powerful, but again mostly still for thin and light machines. And then we have H and then HX, which are their most powerful chips. And it's a similar story with AMD. So for a mid-spec machine, you'd be looking at an i5, perhaps a P or an H series from Intel, or a Ryzen 5 from AMD, and then probably 16 gigs of RAM, 512 storage, and one of these may also come with a dedicated graphics card like a RTX 3050 or a 4050. And to be honest, you don't need anything more powerful than that unless you are doing some proper high-end gaming, or if you have any intensive 4K video editing or 3D rendering tasks. What do I use? Well, that guy, a MacBook Pro 16, which costs quite a lot of money. They start from about £1,800 or so. You can get a smaller 14-inch as well. I absolutely love that thing, but it is an awful lot of money, and also obviously not very good for gaming. Speaking of which, tip number 5, let's talk about the graphics card, which you do need for games, as I whack that, for gaming or for high-end workstation tasks. And while there are tons of options, any GPU will make a huge difference to your frame rates and your performance versus your processor's integrated graphics. So for occasional or sort of lower to mid-range gaming, something along the lines of an NVIDIA RTX 4050 or an older 3060 or an AMD Radeon RX 6500M will be perfectly fine for gaming at 1080p. Although right now I'd say the sweet spot for mobile graphics is either the RTX 4060 or 4070. These are much more capable and allow you to play at higher frame rates, and if you've got a high refresh display, take full advantage of it. Without jumping ahead too much, there are 2 things to consider about the screen when it comes to gaming: the refresh rate and the resolution. Now most laptops are 1080p, full HD, but a lot of gaming laptops, especially higher end models, are 1440p and 4K. Now because you then have so many more pixels to push, if you will, you also need more powerful hardware alongside it to get those high frame rates. So if you are gaming at 1440, I would suggest an RTX 4070 or equivalent, but then we have the refresh rate, and we'll talk more about this in a second, but essentially there's no point getting 200 frames per second in your game if your screen is only 60 Hz. Now almost all gaming laptops have higher 144, 165, 240, even 360 Hz refresh rates, but then of course to take advantage of your high refresh rate, you need a high frame rate, which is where that sort of balance between the hardware specs and the performance and the display come in. Which brings me to tip number 6, the display. And it is so important to get a good screen, because after all, this is what you're going to be looking at all the time. In terms of size, well, bigger screens mean you have more space, which is great for multitasking, and also your movies and your games are more immersive, and I think a 15-inch display is a good balance for most people. And I also reckon up to 15 inches, a full HD 1080p resolution will be absolutely fine. But on anything bigger, or if you do want just a sharper display, then look for Quad HD or QHD Plus resolutions, but I do still maintain 4K is overkill unless you really need it, perhaps for your photo or video editing. There's also a new trend where screens these days for most laptops are 16 by 10, so they're a little bit taller than the more traditional 16 by 9 that you can still get on a lot of laptops, but I do prefer the slightly taller aspect ratio because it just makes your screens, particularly on smaller 13 and 14-inch laptops, just feel a bit less claustrophobic. So if you can, make sure your laptop has a 16 by 10 display, but I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker. In terms of the panel types, well, if you really want to go down this rabbit hole, then I would suggest watching my monitor buying guide, which I'll link at the top right now. But ideally, you're looking for an IPS screen with at least 400 or 500 nits of brightness. Although at the high end, there's really no beating the rich colors and deep blacks of an OLED panel. And while you'll pay a premium for a good one, like this Samsung Galaxy Book 3 Ultra or this Asus ZenBook, you can actually find some Asus VivoBook OLEDs, which are surprisingly affordable. And I've seen some amazing deals on this 15.6-inch model with an Intel Core i3 processor. Now, I mentioned refresh rates when it came to gaming laptops, which is, I think, really where it's the priority, but a lot of mainstream laptops do also now offer 90 and 120 Hz refresh, which makes everything on the desktop and whatever you're doing just feel that bit smoother. Although, I say every mainstream laptop, the MacBook Airs are still stuck to 60 Hz. You have to go Pro if you want their Pro Motion. Many laptops also offer touchscreens, although outside of 2-in-1s where they are essential, they do usually cost extra, and personally, I've never really found myself using touchscreens that much, but it all depends on your workflow. Tip number 7, and let's talk about the ergonomics, the keyboard, the trackpad, what it feels like to use. And actually, this XPS 13 Plus is a really interesting example because it has an edgeless touchpad. You don't actually know where it starts and stops until, well, it stops moving, and I don't love the idea of that in practice. It looks cool. And also, I must admit, I don't love this keyboard. Sometimes form goes over function. So unless you can try out a laptop for yourself in person at a store, then your best option is just checking reviews. See what the reviewers say about the keyboard and trackpad and how comfortable they are. And don't forget, if you buy your laptop online, then in most countries you do have the ability to return it. So you could just, buy it, see if you like it, and then ship it back if it's not your favorite. Tip number 8, and let's talk about these guys, ports, aka connectivity. And essentially, the more ports you have, the more options you have. So an HDMI or a display port is useful for outputting to a monitor or a TV, and if you're a gamer, then a physical RJ45 wired Ethernet port means you can get the fastest internet connection with minimal latency. If you're regularly transferring photos and videos from your camera, then you'll want probably a full-size SD card reader or a micro SD slot, which is more common but not quite as useful. And then we have the trusty USB port, which comes in 2 flavors, either USB-A, aka this sort of older full size, or this newer, smaller and reversible USB-C, which is arguably the most important port right now, and some older or super cheap laptops unfortunately don't get this. But just be aware that not all USB ports are created equal and the speeds can vary massively. So my suggestion would be, if you're going to buy a new laptop, make sure it has at least one USB-C port, and ideally, if it's a higher end model, it'll also support either Thunderbolt 3 or Thunderbolt 4 spec, which basically guarantees a certain level of speed and bandwidth of the port and allows you to output to the highest resolution, highest refresh monitors. But that's not essential for most people, just get at least one USB-C port. And then tip number 9, battery life, which is probably like the second most important thing for most people when they buy a laptop. Price, battery life, performance, I would imagine, which is why I've left it till tip number 9. But anyway, it can vary wildly. And these guys can last anywhere between 5 hours and 15 hours, give or take. But the biggest drains on your battery life will be if you're using a dedicated graphics card and if you have a big high-resolution screen. And also, obviously, it comes down to the size of the battery as well. But generally, what I would say is, whatever the manufacturer says you'll get from a laptop, whether it's 12, 14 hours, whatever, reduce it by like 50%. That's more likely what your everyday use is going to be like. But the battery life is one of the reasons why I do love MacBooks so much, because these will easily last you 10, 15, 20 hours depending on how you're using it. Again, the models will vary, but because Apple uses their own silicon with the M1 and M2 chips inside their own laptops and they make their own macOS software, they have that sort of efficient vertical integration. So unfortunately for now, Windows laptops just can't really compete in terms of that performance and battery life, and crucially performance on battery, because gaming laptops, workstations, high-end Windows laptops, if you want to use the GPU and the high-end performance, then really you need it to be plugged into the charger. You simply don't with MacBooks, which again is a real plus for me. Now, tip number 10, we're almost there, I promise. When should you buy a laptop? Well, there's no perfect time. Generally around Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and the run up to the holiday season, you'll see lots of discounts. Also, when Apple release new MacBooks, you also often see Windows competitors having a bit of a price cut to compete, and also back to school deals, which now we've just kind of missed, usually in late August. But to be honest, there's no one perfect time to buy a laptop. I think Black Friday is probably the best, but laptops generally are refreshed every year with the latest processor processors and maybe better screens or updated ports. But remember, you don't have to go for a new laptop. Why not go for last year's model or a couple of years ago or a refurbished one? Sometimes they can be a little hard to find because manufacturers stop selling them, but if you can find a good deal on a used or refurbished model, generally any laptop from the last 2 or 3 years, depending on what you need it for, is going to be absolutely fine. Although, and that brings me to tip number 11, warranties, support. Obviously, with a used or refurbished model, you may not have the same warranty, and generally the reason you want to go for a bigger known brand is that you're more likely to have better support if you call them up or email them, or 2-year warranties or whatever. And finally, tip number 12, I would definitely say read and watch as many reviews as possible. Individual laptop reviews are the best way of gauging how good or how bad a laptop is, and I would actually say in the last 5 years you can't really get a bad laptop anymore. It's all variations of good and also of course value for money. And also don't forget, you could just upgrade your current one. A lot of laptops, particularly Windows laptops, allow you to upgrade the storage and maybe even the RAM. And if you do have a laptop with an old physical hard disk, an HDD if you will, then upgrading that to an SSD, which isn't particularly difficult, or you could get someone at your local computer store to do it for you, could transform your laptop and mean you don't have to spend £400 or £500 on a new model. So consider upgrading your old laptop first, then perhaps look at some used models or refurbished options that you can get to save some money. And if not, and you are going to go for a new laptop, a shiny new device, then try and get it on some sort of deal. Most laptops at one retailer or another at some point over the course of a couple of months should go on sale. The only ones that don't so much are MacBooks, but then with these and a couple other companies, you do also have the option of an education and teacher discount. Some offer military discounts, so it's worth shopping around to save a few quid. And breathe. So hopefully that was useful. If you've got any questions at all, let me know in the comments below. As I say, I'll leave links to these guys in the description. Hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed watching me sweat and struggle to get through this video while it's like 32 degrees outside. And I will see you next time right here on the Tech Chat. Thanks for watching.